Chapter 8. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the distance was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," said Mrs. Twit, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Well, then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks, that's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Chapter 9. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "Here you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with a chair as he'd been with a walking stick. Every night, when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he'd done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you, sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it!" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me!" she cried. "Oh, tell me, quickly!" "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready! I'll hurry! I'll do anything you say!" cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," he said, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit.